Well, hello, everybody. My name is Sam Levy with the CCO, and I'm here with Byron Borger from Hearts and Minds Books, and this is another episode of 3 books from Hearts and Minds. Byron, how are you?
I'm doing good, Sam. It's great to be with you on this fine October day.
Well, on our last episode, you and Phil talked about some books around politics, and that's certainly not far from any of our minds, probably, whether we like it or not, with the election coming up. If you live in a state like Pennsylvania, as Byron and I do, being an important swing state, you're seeing probably inundated with ads and mailers and lots of conversations likely with friends, family, maybe even strangers, neighbors around politics. And so this is going to kind of, as we continue towards election day, after thinking about books specifically on politics, we're also going to zoom out, I believe, today and look at how we talk about things, that matter, whether that's around politics, around theology, in a world where we don't always agree with one another. Is that right?
Yep, sounds good, Sam. I do think that the last episode, we did 3 books on politics. And in that episode, for those that are watching on YouTube or listening in on Spotify or Apple or whatever, you may recall that I said that I did in my book notes newsletter that you can subscribe to, that I did a whole big list of books of faith and politics, 5 different levels or categories of sophistication, from those that are maybe don't even like politics but want to think faithfully a little bit about being a public disciple, to those that are a little more serious, to some real academic ones on political theory and philosophy. And so the literature is out there. There's lots of good stuff about integrating faith and politics in a way that's mature and thoughtful, biblical and generous. And we highlighted generosity as a way that we engage our public disagreements. And so now you're right. I think it's time to look at some books that'll just help us do that piece of it. These are not necessarily political books, but they are a follow-up to last episode's political theme, because, geez, after this election, there's going to be a lot of conversations, and some of them are not going to be pleasant. I can just tell you that right now. No matter who wins, half America is going to be upset, and many of those people are going to be accusing others of foul play. We've already heard it, particularly from Trump's side, but we've heard it from both sides, that either side is already fishing and fudging and doing wacky stuff. And some of that is just disinformation and untrue. But how you handle those kind of attacks on each other's character, how you get around ways to speak the truth in love, as the Bible puts it, it's a huge, huge topic. And there's a lot of good books on that. So I'm eager to tell you about a couple that will help us sort of converse more freely and more graciously and more honestly. That might give us some handles on doing that.
That's great. And if I might just take one moment, you mentioned your book notes newsletter, just to implore our listeners to subscribe to that newsletter. And Byron is highlighting lots and lots of books on book notes. But one thing that I really enjoy reading that every week, the reality is I'm not going to be able to read all of the books that Byron tries to tell me I should read, right? There's not enough time in the day for all of that. I try to read as widely as I can, but by reading book notes, I can be aware of not only what's being published, but the conversations that are being had around the different themes or topics that Byron will highlight in those newsletters. And so I see that as a really valuable part of my week, of just increasing my own awareness and being able to be conversational about even, books and ideas that I'm not going to be able to read cover to cover or at all, but be aware of. So,
well, thanks for saying that. Yeah, thanks for saying that, Sam, because I do think that's sort of part of what I hope, even the way I describe the books, linking them maybe to other authors or other things that author has done, just to give people the lay of the land so they even know the most important authors and books that are being talked about in our sort of tradition and our particular take on things. There's other books in other traditions and other hot sellers in other camps, but I'm trying to sort of create a certain niche and curate a certain selection of resources for thoughtful Christians. Certainly CCO staff should be knowing this stuff. Of course, our podcast here is co-sponsored by the Coalition for Christian Outreach, the campus ministry that Beth and I serve as booksellers and that you work for. So we're excited for our CCO friends and for our Hearts and Minds friends to listen on. I got 3 books this time on civility and conversation. Should I start telling you about them?
Yeah, let's dive into book number 1.
Okay, Sam. Well, this is one that I think you probably know. It's been around a long time by an author. He's spoken at our Jubilee conference. He's a big fan of CCO, and his name is Richard Mouw. Mouw used to teach political philosophy at Calvin College back in the 70s and 80s, ended up as the president of Fuller Theological Seminary, the most multi-ethnic seminary in the world, I think. He was the president there for a while, and he's emeritus, both as president of Fuller and now back at Grand Rapids at Calvin, doing some seminars and stuff around faith and politics and public philosophy. I've been mentioned in a couple of his books, so I view him as a friend and a mentor. The book I want to tell you about, Uncommon Decency, was popular a couple of years back, even before we got into the sort of particularly anguished polarization that we see now. I adore this book. It is such a useful book. It is so well written. It is so fun. I so esteem Dr. Mouw. You just can't go wrong reading this. The subtitle is Christian Civility in an Uncivil World. And it's only more important now than it was when it first came out. This is the 2nd edition. One of the things that makes this book so strong and so useful is that he suggests that there needs to be both civility, where we treat one another well and fairly, and principled conviction. In other words, if you don't have a lot of conviction, if you don't really care and aren't really passionate and you're so willing to see the other side that you don't even have any arguments with anybody, well, who needs to be civil? That's just be nice. On the other hand, if you've got so much conviction and you're so principally committed that you don't want civility, well, then you become like a bull in a china shop, and you hurt other people badly and give a bad witness to the gospel, no less. So we need both civility and conviction. If you've got plenty of conviction but no civility, that's a problem. If all you've got is civility, well, that's sweet and nice, but who really wants to live in a world where nobody believes anything? But for people that believe deeply and have strongly held convictions, but also want to manage them and hold them lightly and not be a bull in a china shop, this is the resource that we need. It's the best book on the subject. It is enduring. It's been around a long time. A lot of great people like it. I can't say enough about it. So this is my first on the pick. There's one little chapter in here, by the way, that I have to tell you about. It just sort of illustrates his ecumenical spirit and so forth. Those that know Mouw may know that he's a Dutch Christian in the neo-Calvinist tradition of Abram Kuyper, the prime minister of the Netherlands 100 years ago, really influential in the CCO history. This prime minister of Holland that talked about Calvinism, not just as a system of theology, but as a whole world and life view where the lordship of Christ affects every area of life. Okay, so he has this kind of Abram Kuyper tradition, and he's written about Kuyper, by the way, in another little book. He also says that if there's a problem with the Kuyperian tradition, it could be triumphalism. That we want to take over the culture almost. We want to rule too much. We want to honor the lordship of Jesus over every area of life almost too much, where we become belligerent. He compares and contrasts that with Mother Teresa. And in fact, he has a chapter in here called Abram Kuyper, Meet Mother Teresa. And he wonders what the neo-Calvinist Dutch worldview tradition of cultural engagement would look like if we not only had Kuyper's broad vision of the glory of God in every zone of life, but tempered that with the servanthood and kindness of the meek Mother Teresa. I think it's a great chapter. Mother Teresa maybe needs some political vision from Kuyper, and Kuyper needs softened a little bit by the graciousness of the on-the-ground woman who served the poorest of the poor. So anyway, that's just one chapter of this book, and it's worth the price of the book. Abram Kuyper, Meet Mother Teresa. But that gets at, again, the theme of this book, that we can have this uncommon decency with one another as we celebrate our convictions, but also temper them with a graciousness and a servanthood. So, yeah, I love this book, and it's sort of the answer, I think, to our polarized society, is people that have both conviction and committed to pluralism and graciousness.
Yeah, that's great. I think that there's always a temptation if we don't want to have a lack of civility, to kind of back away from conviction, at least in how we express ourselves. But not only, I think, would Mouw argue, and we would both argue that that is not a good idea. It seems to be becoming more and more difficult. A friend of mine remarked the other day that I thought this was a really fascinating insight, that we often talk about the stereotypical thing to like chat about just to make small talk is the weather. But in a world where the conversation around climate change is becoming a bigger and bigger deal, even talking about the weather can be loaded with all sorts of disagreement or misunderstandings of how we see the world, or how our neighbors might see the world. And so more and more we can't, even if we want to, we can't avoid that. And so how do we hold both those things?
It's so interesting you mention that, because I myself use chatting about the weather as a way to sneak in stuff about climate change, and I probe people, and most people don't get it or care. But every now and then people are like, yeah, you had that conversation about the weather, and next thing you're talking about what you believe about the deepest questions of science and meaning and
Yep.
God's care for the creation. Oh, yeah. So you're right. You can't even talk about the weather anymore. One of the nice things about this book, by the way, its first edition was really good. It came out years ago. In the second edition, it came out several years ago, there's a new chapter about the spirituality of civility. Mouw is a public intellectual. He's a public thinker, a public theologian, but he also is a deeply pious man. He loves old hymns. He's sort of an old school evangelical, that loves to tell the story of Jesus. And his chapter on sort of the piety or the spirituality that undergirds a commitment to tolerance and compassionate public discourse is really itself, again, very, very nice. I can't say enough about this. So that's one I'm happy to tell you about. I think Mouw talking even about the weather would be a beautiful thing. Well,
Great.
here's the next one. This is when you get into those kind of disagreements. How can you do that in a loving way? The book is called Loving Disagreement. And it dawns on me that's sort of a play on words too, right? Like you can have loving disagreement, and you can even love disagreement. You can have love, you can be loving the disagreements we have if you're in the power of the Spirit and can navigate disagreement well. It can be something to enjoy even. But of course, the more obvious meaning is how can you have disagreement that is itself loving? The two authors of this book are Khang, Khang, Kathy Khang. She has written for InterVarsity years ago as an Asian American. They did a great anthology called More Than Serving Tea about Asian American women and the way they're nurtured to be servants to others and quiet, perhaps, and what does leadership look like for those in the Asian American college tradition. And then she went on and wrote another book, a feisty book, a powerful book a couple of years ago called Raising Your Voice, about finding your own voice and speaking out. She's blunt. She's a justice advocate. I like Kathy a lot. And her Raising Your Voice book is a guide to doing that. Well, she got together with this other co-author, Matt Mikolatos. Now, Matt is an acquaintance of ours as well. He orders books from us every once in a while. And I'll tell you what, he is really a funny guy. His books are often humorous. He's written fantasy novels imagining Jesus showing up in a 20th century coffee shop. He's written daily devotionals drawing on other religions and world thinkers and stuff. He's an open, generous evangelical who really enjoys a good laugh and writing with wit. So you have these two witty, feisty authors, Kathy and Matt, and they ask a question about pluralism and civility and gracious conversation to the point where they're saying, how can we have disagreements that show love? And the way they get at this, there's no other book on the market like that does this. They try to say we need to build community in our disagreements, and the community needs to be shaped by the fruit of the Spirit. Those of you that know your Bibles know exactly what that means: patience, goodness, kindness, self-control. What are the fruits of the Spirit that our community should show, and how can those fruits allow us to disagree well? So can the fruits of the Spirit manifested in our community give us the virtues to handle conversations where we disagree, and can we do that well? And can our disagreements help us deepen our virtues of being people shaped by the fruits of the Spirit? So the question is, what do you do when you actually love someone that you disagree with? And what happens when our fighting and our disagreements and our dissension and so forth kind of steal the fruits of the Spirit from us. So anyway, I really, really like this book. It's a unique insight into the fruit of the Spirit, and it's a unique insight into disagreement and civility. Sort of takes the Mouw chapter on the spirituality of civility, takes it into the next level, and says, how can our spirituality of disagreement bear the fruit of the Spirit? So if you want to study the fruit of the Spirit, this is a good one. If you want to study civility and disagreements in our political discord, it's a good one. I just think it's really a fabulous book. And it's really, I guess I'd put it this way, it's very practical in the sense that they give you little sidebars and practical application pieces at the end of each chapter. Matt often gives a little comment if it's a chapter that Kathy mostly wrote, or if Kathy mostly wrote the chapter, Matt chimes in with his own little words, and then they each have some application stuff at the end. There's always a little sort of meditation, if you will, a dialogue, and some practical applications about creating space that allows you to do the deep work of learning to be Spirit-led in our communications. So, yeah, great book, great book.
That's really fun when books that are co-authored, where you get a sense of the personal voices of each of the authors like that, and that models the kind of conversational posture that they're talking about. I like that it also reminds us that so often we think, or at least I think many of us fall into the trap of thinking that these conversations where we disagree the goal of those has to be for one party to convince the other
to win,
to come onto their side, right? That's unlikely in most of these conversations of substance, but we can influence each other's thinking, and we can sharpen each other, and we can find other goals in these conversations that don't just have to involve a winner and a loser. We can both win, so to speak, by disagreeing as we engage these discussions. And I think our next book is going to get into those themes as well.
Let me just say one more thing about this too, before we move on to the next one. One of the things that you would like, Sam, because I know you've done some reading on racism and structural injustices and some of the ways to sort of see, as a privileged white male, to see other viewpoints and stuff. This book kind of nails some of that stuff in a playful sort of way. I mean, the very first chapter, every chapter title is clever. You know, the old song from my generation, war, what is it good for? That's the first chapter. It's called War, what is it good for? Disrupting the polarization for God's kingdom's sake. The next chapter is a loving God and loving pizza. And the subtitle is Killing Westernized Love with a Radical Shift. Like, what do we even mean by love? We talk about love and all kinds of things, even pizza. Fighting for peace, the world as it should be. Patience, the chapter you've all been waiting for. That's kind of funny when you think about it. They have another chapter called Great is My Faithfulness. Instead of Great is Thy Faithfulness, Great is My Faithfulness, because it's right when faithful people disagree. Can we find a gentle strength in fragility? There's some really clever, fun reading in this great resource. And they're deep, sharp, thoughtful thinkers that look at the broader context of Western culture and racism and all kind of stuff, but finally at the end of the day getting to the fruits of the Spirit. So yeah, it's a good one. Now this next one is a book that I adored. One real good friend of mine says he doesn't think it's adequate because at the end of the day he doesn't solve our problems of polarization, and I think in a certain sense that's a bad critique, because no book on civility and patience and kindness is going to help us learn to disagree completely properly. And like you said, you're going to have people that are going to view themselves in winners or losers, black and white ways. And so you're always going to have that. The question is, can we learn to do it a bit better? Can we learn to do it well, even if it isn't finally going to solve all our problems of a pluralistic, tolerant culture? So this one is the one that I want to tell you about. And granted, it doesn't have all the answers. He'd be the first to admit that. But it's a great book to get us towards the kind of dialogue that we need. It's called Learning to Disagree. Learning to Disagree. The subtitle is The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. Empathy and Respect. Now, the author of this book is John Inazu. John is a brilliant law professor, and he wrote a scholarly book on Chicago University Press, actually, called Confident Pluralism, on what it means that our culture makes room for religious freedom and different disagreeing well in our culture. We build that into our constitutional republic, that there can be a pluralism of viewpoints. So toleration of others is sort of core to the American worldview and the American democratic experiment. So he's deep into this worldview stuff. He was friends with Tim Keller, and before Tim died, they had co-edited a book together. I heard Inazu once lecture on confident pluralism at Redeemer with Tim Keller interviewing him at the end. It was a great event. We got to sell books there. So Inazu's a good guy. He's a law professor, and that's important to know because this book, it surprised me when it came, is essentially a novel, well, or like a memoir of a year in the life of a law professor. So he's telling the story almost like a memoir or a fictionalized account of a fictional year in his life. And I don't know if it's fictional or real, but it's him going through committees, disagreeing with co-leaders who are faculty advisors, what credits people ought to get, what courses they have to take, and supremely in the classroom. As a law professor, they are looking at the deep differences of interpretation in constitutional law, in the ways freedom of speech works out, and he asks students, and in his law school in this book, many of the students are students of color. Some are radically leftist, some are radically conservative, some are libertarian, some don't even care. And so he has a mix, as you might think of at an elite progressive law school, the mix of students who have vastly different views on things like religious freedom and minority issues and so forth in the university. Some students decide to protest some stuff and don't come to class on time, and he has to navigate that. Of course, in the meantime, he also is doing stuff at home with his wife and his kids, and disagreements come up at home as well about vacations and whatnot. So this is a fun read of a year in the life of a law professor and how learning to disagree well is part of his own learning experiment at the law school where he teaches. And let me just say this, so in case anybody wonders, whether you ever care what a teacher does or whether you care about law or law school is sort of beside the point. That's a vehicle for him to tell the stories of learning to disagree well, to be empathetic, to be caring, to go the extra mile, to understand where people might be coming from and why they think as they do. He does that really well in the book. I think he does it real well in real life, in fact, which gives him the moral authority to tell a story like this. But it is a delightful read. It's an enjoyable read. It's read like a memoir or maybe almost like a novel, where he navigates this year in law school, in committees at the school, in promotions and who gets what jobs and who's jealous of who, behind the scenes in the workplace, and then dealing with students as he's mentoring them and inviting them into this confident pluralism where we believe that there's room to disagree in American culture. He writes as a Christian, but he doesn't wear it on his sleeve. It is published by Zondervan, which is an evangelical publishing house. And so it's a distinctively Christian book. Tish Harrison Warren wrote the lovely foreword. So it is deeply spiritual and overtly Christian, but it is written in such a creative way that you could even give this to a person who doesn't read religious books, because it isn't heavy-handedly theological. He talks about the Bible a little bit and his own faith a little bit in his story, but it isn't primarily the way the other two would be, a deeply spiritual biblical assessment. He's more working at it as a guy that works in a law school and is trying to just understand people and be decent. So it's a lovely study of empathy and concern set in a modern day law school, and it's a hoot of a book. It's really fun to read, and I think could really put us towards getting away from demonizing others and helping us sort of embrace this idea of tolerating other people because we have great empathy for who they are and what they're going through.
Great stuff, Byron, and such important stuff for all of us. I want to offer a challenge because we know that when this election day has passed and when we're not in a presidential election year, and even when U.S. partisan politics aren't the subject of conversation, the importance of being able to disagree well is certainly not going away, and perhaps is becoming a more and more significant thing for us. I think we all can think of people in our lives that we disagree with, maybe, and this is true of me, people that we have not disagreed well and with love and civility, or that mix of civility and conviction that Mouw talks about. So the challenge would be, who in your life might you read this book with and use as a launching pad to be able to continue to have discussions, or maybe start to have discussions about the things with which you disagree, but to do so well, to do so in love, to do so as we want to as Christians. That again, the goal isn't just to come to a point of agreement with everyone on everything, but to be able to have these conversations in the right way. So not only should we read these books and think about these things, but who could you read this with to help spur on one another in love, even in the midst, and especially in the midst of our disagreement. So
well, thanks, Sam. That's a
the
great
challenge.
challenge and a great suggestion. Some people might say, who's somebody I need to give this book to? And I think you're off in the wrong start if you start there and say, there's other people that need to learn to listen to me better. That would be my instinct. Who can I give this book to make them nicer? But yeah, we start with ourselves, take the log out of our own eye, and then find somebody to read this stuff with and form little pockets of loving disagreement, of civility, of learning empathy, and the skills of listening well to others. Yeah, we could change the world if we just played by these rules and learned these skills a bit more. So I do think, particularly moving into this post-election season, it's going to be hot. There's going to be disagreements. It's going to be there. And whether you're politically and civically minded or not, like you said, Sam, it's across the board in other areas of life too. Whether it's aesthetics or movies you like, or theological questions. It isn't just the political stuff where we're polarized, and we've got to learn to be more empathetic and to exhibit the fruits of the Spirit in ways that allow us to disagree better. So I think these are great books for all time, but particularly important moving into this next season.
Amen.
Appreciate you letting me be here. Really love it. 3 books from Hearts and Minds.
Yes, thank you all for listening. To place an order, there's a link in the episode description. Click that first link, and we would appreciate it if you would like and share this podcast with those who might appreciate it. We'd love to hear from you. Contact either one or both of us and read these books. Share what you think in the comments, or send us an email. Let us know. We'd love to be in conversation with you about your experience with these books. And so for Byron, Hearts and Minds Books, and the CCO, this has been another episode of the 3 Books from Hearts and Minds podcast.